Thank you. So I want to say thank you, everyone, for being here today. I would imagine that a lot of people are in the same circumstance that Anders and I are in doing this presentation, and that's likely working from home. I'm thankful today that this is not a live video presentation, as I'm wearing a baseball cap and a t-shirt and taking advantage of my work from home situation. But let me tell you a little bit about me, and then I'll turn it over to Anders to introduce himself. My name is Trent Levitt. I'm a digital forensics manager here at Eide Bailly. I have worked in the digital forensics sector since 2005. I am a former FBI contractor in digital forensics. I hold a bachelor's degree in computer forensics. And everything in my life typically revolves around computer forensics, and that can be anything from cell phones to servers to tablets. And I've worked on almost every type of felony case that you can think of. When I do public presentations, and that's more what I'm accustomed to than webinars, is speaking in public, I will typically play a game where I ask people to pick a felony. And if it's a felony that I haven't worked on, the first person that stumps me will typically get a $5 bill handed to them. That has only backfired once in my career. I was doing a presentation in Bismarck, North Dakota. And the first lady raised her hand and I picked her, and the crime that she picked was art forgery. Now, the correlation between art forgery and digital forensics does not exist as I've ever seen it, and I lost my $5 on the first time. But that being said, I have a wide range of case history that I've worked on, everything from human trafficking to bank robberies, homicides, data breaches, intellectual property theft, corporate espionage, kind of everything you could think of under the sun that involves data and involves a crime. More than likely I've worked on, as long as it's not art forgery. So with that, Anders, could you give us an introduction of yourself, and we'll just keep moving here?
Sure. Anders Erickson. I'm the partner in charge of our cybersecurity consulting services here at Eide Bailly. I've been with Eide Bailly almost 7 years now, over 7 years. Prior to that, I was working for a national firm back in Washington, D.C., where I did IT security consulting and security reviews for the federal government as a contractor. So I really enjoyed and I enjoy interacting with organizations really on the preventative side and helping organizations understand where the risks are, and then bringing solutions to the table that are meaningful, that can help them remove risks or to the best of the ability to manage those risks so they don't end up having to work with Trent and his team down the road.
Thanks, Anders. So here's the three items we're going to be discussing today: is the current environment of where things are at, and then we're going to look at different cybersecurity trends and where things are moving towards, and then we're going to take a look at preventative steps that we can all work on to make sure that our own organizations and ourselves and those that we work with are that much more secure as we move forward in a ever more digital world, especially now where we're working from home across the board.
All right, well, I'm going to take us through some items here as soon as I get control of the screen. There we go. We're going to talk a little bit about the current environment, talk about kind of what we're facing right now when it comes to cybersecurity. You know, we're all of us, as you're aware, are facing this unprecedented threat, and it's really changed the way a lot of us do business and the way we interact with technology. And as a result, I think a lot of us are feeling these yellow words here on the screen: fear, unknown, change, uncertainty, chaos. I know in my own life, just having my kids home from school all the time now, I felt a lot of those emotions just in my own home. But I think we want to try and couch the idea that security, that working with technology doesn't need to bring or add to these types of fears and concerns, that we really can create an environment where we are secure, where we have knowledge that provides us clarity and confidence, and where there is chaos, we can provide order. And so as you begin to move a lot of your workforce off-site, you begin to think about how are we going to take care and secure the data that is now moving out of our four walls of our environment or our data center. How can we secure that? Our goal is to help you feel more confident. And so we would be remiss if we didn't, as part of this presentation, talk a little bit about remote workforce and what that means. And so while we're not going to spend the whole time talking about remote workforce, we thought we'd just take a second and talk about some of the risks associated with remote workers. So there's a recent study that was performed by OpenVPN, which is a company that supports secure communication, and they identified that there's an increase in risks of security incidents when there's an unsecured remote work, when we have remote workers, that there's more chance that there's going to be insecurity, that people are going to have risks and incidents are going to occur. And this study also showed that IT professionals believe remote workers are not secure, and they think they're a greater risk to the organization than having on-site employees. And so there is this, if nothing else, a perception of risk as we move employees off-site. And so we need to address this and understand, well, what is that risk? Why is it so risky moving somebody off-site, not having them in our office? Show you, we pulled together this diagram here. And this is just to help kind of explore. This is just to kind of give a 30,000 foot view. It's very simple, oversimplified, but I wanted to help us understand why there's this risk. On the left side of the screen here is our corporate network. This is sort of our traditional office building where we've got servers and printers and computers, and we're all exchanging data between each other behind this firewall. This firewall is what separates us from the internet. And so the data that moves between our computers is protected to some degree by this firewall. And we show the internet as this cloud because there's a lot of unknown of what's out there. There's malicious actors, there's people who are trying to get access to your data, but we're protected by this firewall. When we have an employee take a computer and go home and they connect it to their Wi-Fi, now that data has to go between their computer and over the Wi-Fi, over the internet, through the firewall, and to your traditional office, to wherever your data is stored. And so this data's got to flow back and forth between these two, and when it's going into areas that we're not sure where it is. And then at the same time, we got to make sure that the people who are connecting to that data are the right people. And so there is a lot of ambiguity and chances for insecurity, and hackers know that this is a problem and that it causes this chaos. And so they're looking for ways to exploit it. And it even makes it more challenging when you've got now a lot of workers, or almost all of our workforce, working remotely. Now all this data is being moved back and forth. We have to find a way to secure it. So we thought today we would just give you some points to consider, the things to take into consideration as you are moving to a remote workforce. And these are conversations you can have with your IT department or with an IT service provider, and make sure that you've got these things in place and consider them. The first is, have you implemented tools for secure connectivity and data transfer? Do you have a way of getting your data from point A to point B? Or even if you've got data that's up in the cloud, we're not going through that firewall, but there's still, these questions can still be purposeful and things to consider. So have you implemented tools for secure connectivity of data transfer? Have you, what can remote workers do with your data? So I'm downloading some corporate data onto my computer in my home. Maybe that's my corporate computer, maybe that's my own home computer, but what can I do with that data now? Could I put it on USB drive? Can I move it up into Dropbox or onto Google Cloud? We're adding risk because our data is now moving places we couldn't foresee in the past. So now we've got to figure out how we're going to connect that, how we're going to let people connect their data, and what can they do with it when they have it. Number three there, have you trained and educated your workforce on how to be secure when working remote offsite? One of the most important things you can give your employees is an understanding that they are part of this, that they are part of the security. They have a role to play, an important role, because now if they don't secure their home network, our corporate network could be in jeopardy, and our data could be compromised. So we have to make sure that we're training them on how to secure their systems. How do you verify the identities of remote workers when they connect to your systems? Because we relied so much on our physical workspace previously to separate the people who should and shouldn't have access. Now all of a sudden someone's trying to authenticate, and we know they're trying to get access to our computers, but they're just on the other side of the internet, and we hope it's the right person. But we have to go beyond just saying, well, give us a password. There needs to be more that we're using to identify and authenticate that individual when they get access to our systems. Number five is, are your employees using their own or company issued computers? Because there's different ways you secure. If I've given someone a company owned computer and said, go home and begin working, the way that the way you secure that is different than if they say, well, I've got my Mac at home, and I'm just going to access my data through my own computer. Well, there's a different way you have to control your data and secure your data using their own computers. So just consider whether you're using your own or company issued computers. And lastly, what solutions are put in place to secure email from malicious actors? Again, it's important to remember that email is not a secure form of communication. By default, it's passed in clear text. And so we're doing a lot more business through email now that we're remote, and we got to make sure that we're setting up, if we are sending information needs to be secured, we're setting up a method that can be transferred securely. So those are just some things to consider when you're thinking about your remote workforce. The other thing we've seen an increase of is, and you might have seen this in the news, is this idea of Zoom bombing. This idea that you could be doing a remote chat on Zoom or some other type of conference video chat, and someone can hijack that, or basically come on and present nefarious information, make comments that are not appropriate. And a lot of this there's a little bit of overreaction, and people saying, well, don't use Zoom or don't use any type of video conferencing. And one of the things that we when clients come to those questions is that it's really a matter of how you set it up. Zoom by itself has the tools to make it secure. You just have to do it. You have to set it up securely and make sure that it's appropriate authentication is being done by the people who are going to access it. So there's two sources I'd point you to, and I think Amy said we're going to send the slides out afterwards, so you'll have access to these. But there was an article by Forbes where they basically provide 7 essential steps to secure a Zoom meeting, and then also Zoom itself on their website has a web page dedicated to security. It talks about how you can set those up securely. So don't shy away from Zoom. It's a great tool to help employees still interact and feel like they're connected. Just make sure you're setting it up securely.
Okay, so what I'd like to cover here are 10 different major issues that have been identified by the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency within the Department of Homeland Security. And the interesting thing with these 10 issues is that they're mostly based on incorrect perceptions of the reality in which we work in. So issue number 1 is the value of data. There's a number of companies or industries out there that really don't put much of a value on the data that they have overall. And I had a conversation with a friend of mine one day, and he owns a landscaping company. It's a sizable company. He has about 35 employees that he works with daily, and has payroll and all the standard things that come with owning a business. And we were talking about security and how he basically has, none from my standpoint. He has no security to work with. And I asked him, I said, well, if a threat actor or a hacker came in and took full access of your business, so to speak, what would you do? And he just shrugged his shoulders. He said, that really doesn't have a bearing on it. He goes, I have a backup of my QuickBooks files, and I would just turn to those. And I said, and what if you had no access to anything? And what I mean by that is we're probably all familiar with some form of ransomware. A hacker will come in, and the hacker will take our photos and our documents and things that are created by us, PowerPoint presentations, and they'll encrypt all of them. And then we get this wonderful message on our screen on how to turn our money into Bitcoin and to then pay them an undisclosed sum. I've seen it as low as $500. I've seen it as high as $50,000 in order for them to send the key back so they can decrypt their data and have it back. A trend that's happening right now is they will just copy all of your data off. They don't worry about encrypting it. They just take all of your data, delete your data, and then they'll run a data wiper on your computer so that a guy like me can't get the data back. It's gone. So in that scenario, which is happening more and more, what value do we place on the data that we have? If we don't think we have anything of value to a hacker, we have to reassess that. Because if you have data, period, it's a value to a hacker, so it should be of value to you. Issue number 2 is who's responsible for security. In mid-sized to larger organizations, we always think it's just the cybersecurity department and the IT department that has the overall responsibility for this. And it's guys like Anders and his team that work with our clients on a regular basis through webinars like this or through live presentations to educate our workforce, to educate those in our companies to understand, what is a spear phishing attack and how do they take place? And, why are there maybe restrictions on, say, Facebook at work, or should there be restrictions on social media at work? Besides the obvious of not being productive if we're sitting on social media all day when we should be working. There's a number of things in there where we find quickly that education is the responsibility of everyone to understand what's taking place. And if we see something that is out of the ordinary, to then notify someone. And that only happens through good and regular education as the trends and issues of threat actors and hackers change, to keep our employees and everyone that we work with up to date on those things. Okay, so Anders and I both agreed this is our favorite picture, our favorite slide of these. So many people, I'll refer back to my friend that owns the landscaping company, security was an unnecessary cost for him. And his perception of this was that it cost too much. Now there is the law of diminishing returns where, you know, if you're a small company with 10 employees, you're not going to spend, you know, an exorbitant amount of money on your security when it could be taken care of in a much smaller and manageable fashion. So often we find that the biggest reason for not having proper security, regardless of the industry that we're working with, and then depending on the size of the company, is that typically they will say it eats too much into my margin that I can't have. They might have private investors that are looking for a certain amount of return, so we have to make certain cuts, and security tends to be one of the first places that we have cuts, and that's something that Anders and I cringe at and we never like to see, but it is the reality of it. But through what we're going to show you today, and especially as Anders goes into preventative tips here in a little bit, you're going to find there's a lot of things that can be done with little to no financial investment on the part of the company to help make your environment more secure. So vendor management, most of us have vendors. I'm a vendor to law enforcement agencies. I'm a vendor to law firms and to private companies that hire my services out. And the perception there is that I'm taking care of security, so they shouldn't have to worry about it. Now, I share confidential files and reports in the work that I do in digital forensics on a daily basis. And there are steps that we have to take within my department to make sure those things are secured from my side. But if I have, for example, about a year ago, I did a corporate espionage case. Very sensitive data that turned into a federal law enforcement case involving the FBI. And we had to make sure that the data that I was sharing back and forth with the client and with the law firm that we were working with was secure in the way we worked that. One of the things that I asked them to do is when that data was not being viewed because of the way we were transporting it, we went very old school and rudimentary. We put it on an external drive and we transported it physically back and forth between my office and the law firm. That's how sensitive and how paranoid we were about this case and what we were dealing with. My request to them was, I've done everything on my side to protect the data while I have it. I need to make sure that when you're not using it, that it's not plugged into your computer. And second, that when you're using this data, that you're not plugged into the internet, and not just disconnect the internet. I asked them to please unplug their cable from their computer so that it was not internet accessible while they were on it. Again, it was just the nature of the case. But the reality of it is we can't rely on our vendors. We have a legal and an ethical responsibility to protect sensitive data that in the long run makes things a whole lot easier and a whole lot less headache in the event of an actual data breach.
You know, maybe Trent, if I could jump in here real quick. I think this was this one issue, this trend of vendor management was really highlighted recently in the Equifax breach. Now it's been a little while now, but
That is correct.
The Equifax was just an interesting breach because my data was part of that. I'm sure many people on the call, when they got the notification that they had been breached, but I never directly gave my data to Equifax. I never said Equifax got my data, but I did sign when I signed on a house. I had a big stack of papers there, and my realtor was like, "You can't read it all, just sign it." So I signed everything, and one of the things in there was a disclosure document saying that the closing company could share my information with Equifax, and so there's these layers to vendors and data that we're sharing with people, that we're giving our data to vendors who are then sharing it with third parties, and we need to understand where our data is going. We've been entrusted with this data. Who are we giving it to, and who are they sharing it with? And can we put in the appropriate construct and controls to make sure that, all right, I'm going to give you this piece of data, but here's what you can and can't do with it as a vendor. Here's what I expect, how I expect you to protect that. So just being aware and being cautious of the data we are sharing and how we're going to control that once we give it to a vendor.
Thanks, Anders. That's a very good point. So issue number 5 is insurance coverage. And this is one that I work in on a regular basis. When we do a data breach, one of the first questions we ask when we get contacted by the company in question is, do you have insurance coverage to cover a data breach? More often than not, they say yes, or they assume that they have it through their general liability insurance. And there have been several circumstances and several cases where it was an assumed part of their general liability insurance that did not exist. So they were left holding the bag, and I will not kid with you that if there's a data breach, it's expensive. On my side, from what myself and my team do, a cheap data breach can run $20,000 to $25,000, and that's for a small case. We just finished I would say a mid-size one last month, and the total amount billed, thankfully, to the insurance company was about $85,000 for this particular data breach. So we need to make sure, from a corporate responsibility standpoint, that if we do have general liability insurance, does it include cyber insurance coverage? And more importantly to that, if it does, how much does it cover you for? Because a standard amount will be $20,000 to $25,000. If you're a decent sized company, say with 100 employees, and we find quickly that that data breach has kind of gone, we usually say lateral across the board, and most computers or people are infected by it in your organization, that $20,000 to $25,000 can quickly be eaten up in a matter of 2 or 3 days, with still a whole lot of work left to do on our part. And then we have to consider the lawyers that are involved and mitigating the risk and notifications, and possibly getting a PR firm involved to help with that as well. So make sure that you have coverage if it's just general liability that's included. If not, talk to your agent, and there should be a questionnaire that they kind of go through with you to make sure that you have enough coverage. I'll say that the insurance, cybersecurity insurance, is typically very cheap. It's usually anywhere from $600 to $1,200 a year. If you're a much larger organization, it could go into a few $1,000s a year. There may be things that the underwriter asks that you have in place from a cybersecurity standpoint, so you're not just wide out in the open and saying, come hack me, I don't care, I've got insurance. But generally, it's very, very cheap compared to the alternative of not having it or not having enough and having that false sense of security. So insider threats. Now, insider threats is something that I work in many different forms and fashions quite often. The standard perception is that the greatest cyber threat to any organization is going to come from China or Russia. Other countries I could throw in there are Romania, Vietnam, Thailand. There's a lot of different standard countries that when we do a data breach and we trace it back to a possible location, these are the normal places that we're coming up with. The two most popular are China and Russia. The reality of it, though, is we have a great deal of threats from right within our own organization. As Anders alluded to, as we're working remotely now, there is a greater threat of the data that we're working with becoming exposed. And we have to make sure we're taking those steps with our employees to make sure that data is secured. And that's where Anders works on a daily basis. Anders and I have a unique working dynamic. Anders' goal every day when he gets up and comes to work is to make sure that Trent doesn't have anything to do. If Anders is helping our clients stay secured through proper cybersecurity, then the chances of a data breach get diminished a great deal. That means I have nothing to do. I have to go find other things to do. So while I like Anders, and I do make my living off of data breaches, it's very important that Anders and I work together and that he makes sure that I basically have nothing to do as we move forward on this. But in having insider threats, what are our employees doing with their data? And more importantly, if an employee leaves a company and let's say goes to work for a competitor, and that's a normal thing, it happens all the time regardless of the industry, are we taking steps to take a look at, did they take anything with them from their computers, from the network, prior to their leaving? There's a number of intellectual property theft cases that I work on every year, or employment cases that deal with this very thing, that become very real when they see a dip in sales or a dip in revenue because of the potential or the actuality that they did take data from the company prior to leaving. And then as Anders talked about, as we are now in a mostly remote working environment, what are we doing to secure the data and make sure that it doesn't become accessible to a threat actor? So the assumed knowledge, and a lot of tech companies, you would think have a better grasp on security in their technology, but they don't. I work in, my office is in Lehi, Utah, and I work directly in what's called the Silicon Slopes area, and I'm surrounded by tech companies that are constantly having problems with data breaches or security issues, because this is exactly what they think. I hire young people and they know how to be secure online. When the reality of things is that age has nothing to do with better cybersecurity practices. In fact, many young people are very just accustomed to not being secure. They understand that if they get an email from a Nigerian prince, it's something to laugh at. But in general, how often do we hear about Facebook accounts or Instagram accounts being hacked, Gmail accounts being hacked on a regular basis? And as new technology comes out that young people move to, let's say TikTok, for example, TikTok is not terribly secure at this point. And if we're allowing our employees to be on things like TikTok or Facebook while at work, it becomes an easy way to infiltrate your network through a means of which we didn't take into account most of the time. So,
go ahead. I was just gonna step in here. We do a presentation on generational differences in the workplace and the security impacts of those generational differences. And what's so interesting is that a lot of younger people who are coming into the workforce now, they have a different perception of privacy and of security. They don't think about or are concerned as much with their data being out there. It's just part of what they grew up as. Yeah, I put everything on Facebook. People know about me, and they have this. There's in their mind there's this security through just getting it all out there. But when we come into a corporate environment and we begin saying, listen, this is our corporate data, we've been entrusted with this information by our customers, our clients, all of a sudden that same perception of openness can't exist. And so there's almost a dichotomy in how the difference between how they operate on their personal lives and how they have to operate when they come to work, and that education needs to take place.
Absolutely. Thank you, Anders. So this is one that I run into a lot, again, in conversations with business owners that I interact with, is that compliance is security and security is compliance. And that statement couldn't be further from the truth. So many people think that I'm in compliance with my industry standards, so I'm secure as well. And that's not the reason for compliance in most industries. So we need to be very careful in looking at our compliance. The compliance does not equal security, and security certainly doesn't mean compliance. If you take HIPAA, for example, if you are HIPAA secure, that does not mean by any stretch of the imagination that you're HIPAA compliant. They're two very different things. So we need to make sure to keep those on two different parallel lines rather than letting those lines cross and weave back and forth with each other. That can end up causing trouble for our organizations and for ourselves down the road. But compliance is not security. Go ahead, Anders.
I was going to say another area we see this a lot in is we'll go into organizations and they will have purchase cards that they process, and so they'll be PCI compliant. That's what the purchase card industry has set out, a set of data security standards, and they'll have a third party come in and evaluate their purchase card system. They'll feel like they've got security, but that is a very focused compliance effort on just those transactions and processes that use that purchase card. But there's a much larger construct within the organization of their IT infrastructure and their policies and their culture that isn't considered with PCI. And so just recognizing that whatever compliance aspect you're looking at, it tends to be very focused and finite, and there needs to be a larger view of security that really takes into the organization's culture, or in consideration the organization's culture and their processes and programs beyond just that compliance activity.
So physical security is actually kind of a fun one for me because especially here in America, we have a culture of openness and we allow anyone to walk through our offices and we don't have anything to hide. We don't think that people will do things out of the ordinary when they come into our office. Let me give you a great example of something that I experienced with my wife about 1.5 years ago. We were walking through a large commercial furniture store and there was a salesman sitting at a computer and he got up and walked away. Now, about a week before that, I happened to just purchase a piece of software off the internet. It was about, I think it was $89. And you can bring it, you get it in the mail and you plug it into your computer and it will literally walk you through the steps of setting this piece of software up that allows me to then go plug it into anyone else's computer. And all I have to do is hit the space bar once it's plugged in and it executes. And what I set that up to do was to take any and all information from that computer, from the past, and anything moving forward, and through a port that automatically opens up through the program, start pushing that data directly to me. Now, while I work in digital forensics, I am not a hacker. But this tool, again, for $89, walked me through the steps of setting this up. And as we walked through this large commercial furniture store, there was a computer sitting there with a USB port. Now, why do you need to have a USB port on a computer at a furniture store? You probably don't. But I just pointed at it and I said, there's a perfect opportunity for me to learn everything I would want to know about this company and to cause it a great deal of havoc if I chose. I'd prefer to stay out of jail, and that's why I don't do those things. But it was something that we were testing in our lab, but I just pointed at it. I said, all I have to do is plug in this USB device. The computer actually recognizes it as a keyboard being plugged in and not anything else. And all I have to do is let it recognize the USB device, hit the space bar, and I can walk away. I can lose the USB device and I don't care. I have access to their system, or if I can stand there for a minute or two, I can pull it out and I have everything that I need from that point moving forward and hopefully be undetected. So the point of that is our physical security of our offices, of our workplaces, is just as important as our digital security that we focus on so much. We can't discount the importance of either. So think about your own office spaces, and if you have vendors that come through, if you have customers that come through that even for 30 seconds would have access to something like this. These types of tools are becoming more and more popular, and they're actually becoming more and more affordable. So if you have someone that's curious about wanting to be what we call a script kiddie hacker, they can purchase this for $89 or something like it, and in a matter of just moments in your organization can wreak havoc upon you, and it would take a great deal of time to rectify that situation. So new technology, this is one I had personal experience with a couple of years ago. I actually got an ad on Facebook for this camera that plugs into your phone. And it's kind of a snaking camera. It was about 18 inches long, so you can move it around corners, and it's flexible and bendable. You can run it through pipes and see where things are at. And so I purchased it. I think it was $30. And when I got it in the mail, it didn't look right. I'll just say the English instructions didn't look or read like they were written by someone that speaks English very well. So we moved it into our controlled environment in our lab, and I decided to do some testing with it. And what I found was that this piece of software this piece of hardware that I plug into my phone, there's software built into it so that it can work with your phone. But what I found in putting it into a controlled environment is that this was riddled with malware. And not being a malware expert, I took the time in the evenings to look into this malware and what it does and to test it out. And I actually had quite a bit of fun with it because I recognized it beforehand. Had I not, it wouldn't have been very much fun. It basically was a full control malware pieces that took full control of my cell phone, just by way of example. So any pictures that I took, for example, would be on my phone, but would also be sent back to an undisclosed location that was already set up on this, much like the software piece that I purchased prior, that they could see all my photos. All of my text messages were also pushed every time my phone had Wi-Fi. And there's a hiding factor there. if your phone is hacked and it's constantly sending data through your data plan, especially when data plans were smaller, you would eat through your data plan quickly throughout the month. But you can set those up to where they only work when your phone is on a Wi-Fi. And then it can send all the data that it wants. It's just caching it until it recognizes that it's on Wi-Fi. So we need to be careful with any new software and devices that they're secure before we buy them, and make sure that even if they market it and promote it as secure, it doesn't always mean that it's secure. Lenovo computers were recognized years ago as having hidden pieces of malware on them as they were being brought into the United States. So we need to make sure that our technology is secure and verified before we bring it into our work environments, because it can cause, again, a great deal of havoc as we move forward in trying to use that software. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Anders, and he's going to go through the preventative steps and what we can do to make sure that these types of things don't happen to us.
All right, so we're going to talk about some preventative steps. What can you begin to do to secure your environment? One of the things that Trent brought up in these trends is this idea that this misperception that security is expensive. And there are some things in security that do cost money, but there are some fundamental security principles that you can put in place and under controlled costs that'll help to begin to reduce your risk. This is an approach to cybersecurity that Ide Bailey developed, and we developed this as a cybersecurity team in concert with our incident response team. When Trent and his team would go in to do an incident, so a company had gotten hacked, there had been some malware deployed, we would go in with them with the understanding that we would help in the remediation efforts, but also understand why was the organization hacked? What could they have done? What could they have put in place so this wouldn't have happened? And based on that understanding of the things they hadn't put in place, we pulled together this best practice approach that begins with this stage one, which is foundational security. These are 7 security practices every organization should have. I don't care how small you are or how big you are. These are 7 things you should have, and you're going to considerably reduce your risk if you've done these 7 things. So that's our stage 1. Stage 2 is critical processes, and I'm not going to get into the details of these today, but once you've established foundational security, you should consider these key processes, things like managing the vulnerabilities in your system, making sure you have incident response in place, making sure security awareness training are in place. And then lastly is key activities under stage 3. These are very situational. If you do a lot of email, you make sure that's encrypted. If you use a lot of mobile devices, you want some mobile device and telecommuting, and then system monitoring. But what I want to focus on today is this idea of these foundational security, that whoever you are, whatever your company is, you really should be doing these 7 things. And a lot of these don't take a lot more money than you're already spending on. And what we tell small and mid-sized organizations is often you don't necessarily need someone to come in and do a lot of consulting and spend a lot on tools. What you need is sound IT management. Cybersecurity, a lot of times for this foundational security, is just good IT management. You need a good IT group or IT service provider who can give you these things and put these things in place. So let's walk through these stage 1 foundational security principles. The first one is administrative access. Recognizing that somebody, for every system, someone's got the keys to the kingdom. That might be your service provider, that might be someone in your IT group, but somebody's got administrative access, and they have a lot of power with that. They can do a lot with your data. And this should not be non-IT people. This should be people who are specifically responsible for the systems. And granted, a lot of small organizations, you're going to have someone in management who has to have administrative rights, and that's just because we've got a small organization. But what we don't want is general users having administrative access, either to the servers or to their individual workstations. These need to be locked down, because if I'm a hacker, that's one of the first things I'm going to go after, is try to get administrative access. Because I know once I've got administrative access, you can't stop me. I can create a new user. I could create a new user, perform an activity, and remove that user, and nobody would ever know. So the administrative access and locking that down is critical. And 97% of Microsoft vulnerabilities would be mitigated by removing administrative rights. So you're taking out 97% of all your vulnerabilities that Microsoft has. And a lot of the vulnerabilities are based on Microsoft software. So 97% would be mitigated if you removed administrative rights. So that's the very first thing, is get rid of administrative access, or limit administrative access to just those who need it. And even if you have someone with administrative access, that's not what you should be logging into every day. Log in using your regular account, just a general user account, and only use the administrative account when you actually need to perform administrative activity. So continuing on here, we're going to go to stage one. This is the second principle, and this is data backup and recovery. When I first started in security, data backup and recovery was this idea that someday, the idea behind it was someday our data center might have a fire or a flood, and we need to be able to get that data back. The idea of ransomware, or the advent of ransomware and the rise of ransomware, has really changed the necessity and highlighted the necessity for good backups. The ransomware has become very rampant. Again, this is the idea that a hacker, ransomware is the idea that a hacker is going to send you a piece of software through an email or through a message, and it's going to, and when you click on that link, either a link or an embedded document or attached document, it's going to deploy a piece of malware that will begin encrypting your system. And they have the key to unencrypt it. You won't be able to get to any of your data until you pay them a ransom for the key, the digital key to unencrypt the data. That's ransomware. But if you have backup copies of your data, that's your get out of jail free card. They cannot hold you at ransom if you have backups of your data, because all you have to do is restore that data. But it has to be done. It has to be done right. You have to make sure that you've got those backups stored correctly, that you are backing up the data at the right intervals, so that when you restore it, it's meaningful and the encrypted information or the encrypted software couldn't get to it. So making sure you got backups in place is critical going forward. The next stage is the next fundamental cybersecurity principle is email gateway security. Email is the hacker's gateway into your organization. That we see 90% of cybersecurity attacks begin with a phishing email, and this is trying to get an employee to click on a link. If they click on a link or they open an attachment, that hacker is going to be able to deploy that software, or it's going to go back to the hacker's website or the hacker's computer, and the hacker's going to be able to take control of that system. So an email gateway basically scans emails. It looks for things that indicate this could be a malicious attack. So Proofpoint, Office 365, these are tools that can be set up. I could say Minecraft because I got my kids' head on. I got my kids, but they're Mimecast. Mimecast is another tool. These are email gateway security tools that scan incoming emails and take away ones or identify ones that are potential malicious emails. And so your users don't even have to get it. Your users won't even get that email. So think of it as a traffic light. It's going to stop things before they even get to your user's inbox. The next thing every organization should do is email phishing exercises, because inevitably something's going to get through. Hackers are becoming very good at making emails look like they're legitimate. And so we have to continue to educate our users on what those look like and what to look for. And there's nothing better than doing simulated email phishing exercises. There's software out there, and if you have questions, I can point you to some good software tools. But there's software out there that'll actually help run mock email phishing campaigns, where your employees will get what looks like a legitimate email, and they'll have to discern whether that's a legitimate email or not. And if they click on the link, well, they're going to be the ones who get 5 minutes of security awareness training. You target the people who are clicking on these links and the people who are causing risk to your organization. And so email phishing exercises, we'll usually see, when we start off, we'll see usually around 20, even 30% hit rates. So failure rates, meaning 20-30% of users will click on the links. But over time, we can get that down to about 7%. So you can see that you really significantly drop your risk if you're doing these email phishing exercises. The next principle that every organization should have is endpoint protection. Traditionally, this would be looked at as something like an Norton antivirus or McAfee. But these older antivirus tools don't address some of the new risks that are out there. When we talk about an endpoint protection, we're talking about where the data ends up. It's really the user's workstation. I got a couple different workstations on here. You can see some of these are a little bit old. You can see that bottom right ones. That's like my own personal. That's my Commodore 64. My dad bought us when we were a kid. But that's an endpoint. An endpoint is where the computer ends up. It's the endpoint of a message, is where it's delivered to, and that's where so much risk takes place. That's where malware is deployed. Is it on the individual workstations? And so newer endpoint technologies, not the Norton antivirus, not the McAfee, they've got some good tools, but the traditional antivirus is not capturing these new threats. New tools like CrowdStrike, Carbon Black, these types of tools are more proactive, and they're looking for trends and signatures. They've got artificial intelligence built into them to say, hey, this doesn't look like this process is or program is operating like it should. And so it stops things before they become a problem, before they can propagate. And a lot of times that ransomware can some of these tools will actually isolate an endpoint as soon as ransomware is deployed, and so it would never actually get to the rest of the organization. So having a good endpoint protection and next generation endpoint protection is important. A firewall security service is important. Now, again, we talked about firewall, and we talked about the challenges of remote workers. The firewall is what separates your good information, your corporate network from the internet. And even if you've got remote workers, this firewall is still important because your users are authenticated to data that's behind the firewall. And what a firewall traditionally would do is just kind of say, it would give some very general rules of do allow this or that type of information to come through. But sort of next generation firewall services can really break down the information that's coming across a network, coming into your network, and take out the pieces that potentially are malicious. So what this diagram shows us, you've got on the top right, left corner here, you've got this, maybe it's a Gmail message coming in, and attached to it is this exploit of confidential data. And so the hacker's trying to get this into your network. Well, a firewall will be able to take that message, it'll be able to remove that exploit and pass just the good information along to the authorized user. So you can see it's able to remove pieces from the data, not just block something altogether. So having a good firewall with security services is critical, and it's not something you just go down to Best Buy and purchase. This is something you really want a professional to come in and install. And surprising, the prices are continuing to come down on these. So this is not an expensive buy, but it's a good investment to secure your organization. As we're winding down here, just the last couple of the multi-factor authentication is critical. And we talked about this a little bit earlier when we were talking about securing a remote workforce. And how are we authenticating our workers? We can't just rely on solely a password. We have to have something more to know who they are and to verify that they are the person they say they are. And so we want to implement what's called multi-factor authentication. This is the idea that what's going to authenticate a user is one of three things, or two of three things: something they know, something they are, and something they have. For example, something they know is when we have passwords. We know a password. But let's say there's something that they have, something like their phone, their cell phone. Well, when someone puts in their password, Microsoft Office 365 can set it up so after they put their password in, it will send digital key, or it'll send a PIN number to the phone for that user on file. And they have to physically have that phone to look at it, receive that PIN, and then put that PIN in. And only then will they get access to Office 365. Google has the same type of what they call multi-factor or dual factor authentication. But look for these types of technologies, implement these where you can, because this will cut off 90%, 98% is what the research shows. This will cut off 98% of vulnerabilities because you put in that extra layer of authentication. So multi-factor authentication is critical.
Let me jump in here really quick, Anders, and
Yep.
say just to emphasize this. I deal with people not just from a work environment, from just a personal environment, that their social media or different accounts get taken over or hacked on a regular basis. And the first thing I ask them is, do you have two-factor authentication or multi-factor authentication? They say no. It is absolutely critical to have it. Whether it's your banking or your social media, you guys have to have it. It is free and it's easy. Please, please have it.
Thank you. Look for those opportunities to implement that. All right. I think that's all we have as far as these. Again, the things we've just gone over are these 7 fundamental cybersecurity things. Every organization should have these to some degree. So if you have questions on those, don't hesitate to reach out and contact us. We wanted to end today with this. We threw the slide at the end. Trent had mentioned earlier cyber liability insurance, and it's really, I think organizations struggle on how much should I get. And this is a calculator we point people to. This is an organization called eRisk Hub, and they help companies get in touch with the appropriate broker for their industry and their organization to get insurance. And they have a no-cost data breach cost calculator. This is a great tool in understanding how much cyber liability insurance you might need to get. It'll ask you a couple simple questions on the type of data you house, the number of pieces of data you have, and the industry you're in, and it'll help you begin to understand what the risk might be and what you might need to be getting as far as coverage. So just another tool to help you out there. That's all we've got for you today, folks. We really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you about these cyber trends. This is again, this is an area that's going to continue to be a challenge for organizations, and the hackers recognize we're all sort of in an age of disruption with this, with the current environment and working remotely, but they're not stopping. We've seen continued data breaches happening in the workplace. So if you've seen anything today that you feel like you have questions about or you need help with, please don't hesitate to reach out to myself or to Trent, and we'd love to help you out or just point you in the right direction. There's a lot of free tools available out there and just resources we can point you to, but we appreciate your time today. Thanks so much.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Anders, and thank you, Trent, and thank you to everyone who attended, and we hope you guys have a great day.